Well, it's been reported that the government is expected to announce a tax hike for about 25 million people in a move that would cap social care costs for individuals and increase funding for the NHS. According to The Telegraph, the Prime Minister is due to reveal next week the rise in national insurance. It's understood Boris Johnson's office favours a 1% rise in the tax, while the Treasury is possibly looking at a higher rate of 1.25%. In return, the government will cap the amount a person can spend on social care costs during their lifetime, possibly at between £60,000 and £80,000.
It's still lots of money, isn't it? Well, to discuss this further, we're joined now by Duncan Simpson, Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you very much, Duncan. Look, just whiz me through this. Give me an overview before we get stuck into the actual brass tacks of it, if you'll forgive the phrase.
That's right. So there's a few proposals floating around. The government has said for numerous years they're going to introduce a social care plan to really, grasp the numerous problems of which there are in the system. Now, recall, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a social care precept introduced to your council tax in England and Wales, which was introduced at the time to address quite a few immediate problems in the provision of social care by local authorities. What they're doing now, from the reports we're hearing this morning, is to introduce basically a hike on the normal, I think, Class 1 national insurance rates, which most employees and employers pay. Now, there is, as we understand, some disagreements between government departments. As you say, I think the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are more keen to introduce a 1% hike, whereas the Department for Health and Social Care is considering a 2% increase. Now, the 2% increase could raise something like £10 billion. May not be that high, may be higher, all the same. But ultimately, the objective is the same. They want to increase national insurance specifically to pay for national, maybe a slightly more nationalised system of social care across the UK.
OK, all right. And frankly, a lot of people don't really want to pay any more tax. A lot of people, I remember, was a local reporter having to sit through endless local council tax meetings, and the tax never went down, did it? And the question of whether or not you got bang for your buck was an issue. Do you think this is going to be value for money for people? Is this an area of tax where people wouldn't mind paying?
I have quite a few concerns about this. I think, first off, it's a hypothecated tax, which essentially means that the revenue derived from this is to be used for the payment of a service, in this case, social care. Now, generally speaking, when we've seen that introduced in the past in this country and across the world, when you introduce a hypothecated tax, that often leads to waste. You'll have calls for more. You'll have people saying this has been quite rightly been implemented quite badly. So I'd be slightly nervous about that. But take a step back and look at the bigger picture as well. If we look at national insurance, just national insurance contributions by themselves, we're this year going to be paying about £150 billion in those contributions. By the end of this parliament, you're looking at about £170 billion. The tax system overall in the UK is pretty steep on working people. We know that national account taxes, so that means the proportion of taxes relative to the size of the economy, is the biggest it's been since 1969. If we look at a sort of a 5-year average to smooth out things like coronavirus and the financial crisis, then it's the biggest in 70 years. So it's already the case that the UK is an incredibly highly taxed economy. Now, obviously, this is a country which is got an aging population. That's not unique to the UK. That's the case across the world. So necessarily, we are going to be paying more for our healthcare, for social care, and numerous provisions which we can't rely on from the state. One innovation that you could introduce, however, is something like a sort of a personal health account. So rather than this tax going to the Treasury and then the Treasury doling it out to various government departments and then provide social care in the future, essentially you have much more control in terms of what kind of healthcare that you would be accessing it. You might, it might be a mandatory system, or it could be a slightly more voluntary approach. For example, we have, auto enrollments with pensions. Essentially, a proportion of my income, I'm sure many people listening to this, is taken out each month, which goes into the pension. I can ultimately choose not to pay into that. My employer doesn't pay into that as well. But ultimately, having a bit more control over the provision of social care and many other areas of healthcare in the future might be a slightly better way to go down, rather than ramping up taxes even further, particularly in national insurance, which has been the case in recent years.
And also, Duncan, whilst we know that there are many young people do use the social care system or do need social care, has been some criticism saying that this may store up generational resentment because we're having people of working age essentially paying for something that is disproportionately used by the elderly. What do you think about this argument that this could, cause conflict between the generations?
I think it's a very fair concern. No, I haven't quite decided in terms of what state pensions will be increasing next year. At the moment, we have the triple lock, which essentially means that the state pension will increase every year by 2% or inflation or average earnings, whichever is highest. Now, average earnings last year was something like 8%. Because obviously there was a big dip in employment and then a big increase when people were coming off furlough. So that's a pretty unfair system. Added to which, national insurance payments, unless you're self-employed, you don't pay those when you reach state pension age. Now, obviously, a lot of people will be retiring at state pension age or just before, but ultimately, if you stay in normal employment, I think it's pretty unreasonable when you've got workers who are half your age are being compelled to pay national insurance, and your employer still pays national insurance, but the individual doesn't. So I think on those two specific issues, it's pretty unreasonable if the government is going to be demanding, as you say, people my age to essentially be paying for something which I may well be using 30 years down the track, but it is ultimately trying to meet the demands of and the pressures which are already there, and arguably which the government has created itself. So I think it's a very fair concern, and without those kind of changes, particularly on the state pension, it could be something like moving to a double lock and get rid of the triple element. A lot of people are going to be pretty aggrieved, and also bear in mind, 18 months ago we were all told to stay inside to first and foremost, look after the health of old people who are most vulnerable to coronavirus. So if the government's not careful about this, I think resentment will certainly increase, and quite rightly.
Duncan, thank you very, very much. Duncan Simpson there, Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance.